In the immediate aftermath of the 1960 presidential election, when Democrat John F. Kennedy was declared the winner against Republican Richard M. Nixon, the incumbent President Dwight D. Eisenhower was in disbelief. Ike had vigorously campaigned for Vice President Nixon and feared that the Democratic ticket of Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson would forever tarnish his legacy. Throughout the 1960 campaign, he called JFK incompetent compared to Nixon and labeled LBJ as the most tricky and unreliable politician in Congress. When Eisenhower learned that Nixon had lost, he was devastated, saying he felt as though had been hit in the solar plexus with a baseball bat. On the morning after the election, Ike would also say to his son John that all I've been trying to do for 8 years has gone down the drain. But by the end of November, as later returns showed a more narrow victory for Kennedy, President Eisenhower started to question the results. Ike called his Attorney General William Rogers to investigate, saying he was disturbed about continuing allegations of fraud in the election. No doubt, the president was hearing the murmurs that the Kennedy campaign had rigged the election in key swing states such as Illinois, where the Democratic nominee won by fewer than 9,000 votes. On the 24th, the Chicago Tribune declared that it is a good guess that in an honest election, Mr. Nixon would have carried Illinois by 100,000 votes. While Nixon conceded to Kennedy soon after Election Day, the chairman of the Republican National Committee, Thurston Morton, refused to do so, claiming fraud. Nixon's VP pick, Henry Cabot Lodge, also reflected years later that they would have taken Chicago in 1960 if there had been an honest count. Representative Pat Hillings of California would also tell Nixon after the loss, "I believe you would be our president today if the election had not been stolen from us in certain places such as Illinois and Texas." So was there any credible evidence of a stolen election? I am aware of the skepticism this topic may evoke. After all, the modern GOP also made baseless and false claims about the 2020 presidential election being stolen, so one could easily dismiss the charges made in 1960 as just another half-baked conspiracy theory perpetuated by sore losers within the Republican Party. But over the course of American history, there have been a few times when fraud had, in fact, affected the outcome of a major campaign. Examples include the election of 1876, when Republican Rutherford B. Hayes defeated Samuel Tilden. Although both sides at the time engaged in illicit activities, the fraudulent vote counting done by Republicans outdid the voter intimidation carried out by Democrats, and Hayes was determined the winner. A more recent example of a flawed presidential election occurred in 2000, when the conservative-aligned Supreme Court stopped a recount in Florida, which many now recognize would have resulted in a victory for Democrat Al Gore over Republican George W. Bush. But while there's more of a consensus that 1876 and 2000 were stolen, the 1960 presidential election, one of the closest presidential races in American history, still has historians debating whether or not John F. Kennedy won through legitimate or illegitimate means. So in this episode, we will take a careful look at this question by relying on 7 books from reputable academics and journalists as our primary sources. We will first give an overview of the context of the 1960 election, and then we will summarize the main charges against the Kennedy campaign, particularly in the 2 swing states of Illinois and Texas, to better judge whether his victory was legitimate. At the end of the video, I hope you will leave a comment with your verdict. Did John F. Kennedy steal the 1960 presidential election, or did he win fair and square? The conventional wisdom surrounding the 1960 presidential election has been that John F. Kennedy won because he was a suave, young, handsome, charismatic, once-in-a-lifetime candidate, and he was up against a crooked, unattractive, villainous politician named Richard Nixon, whom nobody really liked. But if this prevailing narrative were the case, how can we explain the fact that the presidential race ended up being so close? The truth is that 1960 pitted 2 fierce campaigners, neither of whom had ever lost an election before. Both Kennedy and Nixon had their unique advantages and disadvantages, which guaranteed the election wasn't going to end in a blowout for one side or the other. Jack Kennedy's real advantage was his war chest. His father, Joseph Kennedy, was at the time one of the wealthiest men in the United States, and he was determined to eventually make his son the first Catholic president. Jack's very first run for Congress came after his father had bribed the incumbent representative James Curley of the Massachusetts 11th District to vacate his seat so that his son could run. Curley, who was having financial troubles at the time, took the money, and the young Jack Kennedy took the seat in 1947. In 1952, when Jack made his bid for the Senate, His father helped again with a loan of $500,000 to the Boston Post. The next day, the same newspaper announced its endorsement of Kennedy. Joseph Kennedy's lavish spending on his son was so well known that it even became a running joke within the Kennedy family. In 1958, when Jack was giving a speech in D.C., he read out a fake telegram from his father, meant to be humorous. It read, "Dear Jack, don't buy another vote. I'll be damned if I'm going to pay for a landslide." But JFK's great wealth was also his weakness as a candidate, as it caused concern from Democratic leaders during the 1960 primary season. Although he had to overcome some anti-Catholic bigotry within the party, Kennedy's biggest obstacle was the perception of him as a chosen scion of a wealthy and power-hungry millionaire. For instance, on May 3, 1960, when former President Harry Truman was asked by a student, "What's going to happen when the Pope moves into the White House?" Truman responded, "It's not the Pope I'm afraid of, it's the Pop," referring to Jack's wealthy father. Truman also said, "Old Joe Kennedy is as big of a crook as we've got anywhere in this country." Eleanor Roosevelt, the widow of FDR, also made a similar critique. She complained that Kennedy's father had been spending oodles of money all over the country and probably has paid representatives in every state by now. Indeed, with the oodles of help from his dad's money, John F. Kennedy did, in fact, essentially buy the Democratic presidential nomination. In the 1960 primary, JFK's main liberal opponent was Minnesota Senator Hubert Humphrey, who first gained notoriety within the party with a fiery speech during the 1948 Democratic National Convention, in which he called for the addition of a civil rights plank into the party's platform. Humphrey, not Kennedy, was seen as the more progressive choice for racial equality, even earning the endorsement of civil rights activist Jackie Robinson, the baseball legend who broke the Major League's color barrier. But in the Democratic primary, Kennedy completely outspent Humphrey in two key states, Wisconsin and West Virginia. In Wisconsin, Humphrey initially had the edge as he represented a neighboring state, but the Kennedy campaign succeeded in mobilizing the Catholic vote through some dirty political shenanigans. Jack's brother, Bobby, hired a trickster named Paul Corbin to distribute 5,000 anti-Catholic mailers to Catholic residents across Wisconsin. As planned, Humphrey got the blame for the flyers, the Kennedy campaign painted themselves as the victim of bigotry, and the Catholic vote mobilized in retaliation. John F. Kennedy would end up winning in Wisconsin in April. Next came the other pivotal battle for West Virginia. In this case, in one of the poorest and corrupt states in the country, the Kennedy campaign simply and blatantly resorted to vote buying. Bobby Kennedy's hatchet man, Paul Corbin, would this time openly brag that he handed out $10 bills to get people to vote for Kennedy. The Democratic chairman of Logan County, Raymond Chafin, who initially backed Humphrey, changed his endorsement after receiving a $35,000 bribe from the Kennedy campaign. When Humphrey dropped out of the primaries after losing in West Virginia, he explicitly lamented the fact that he couldn't afford to run through the state with a little black bag and a checkbook. Kennedy's path to the Democratic nomination was now secure. Meanwhile, on the Republican side, Richard Nixon enjoyed an advantage stemming from his role in a fairly popular administration of Eisenhower. But in 1960, Ike's VP faced the challenge of uniting the Republican Party at a time when it was going through an ideological evolution. Although Nixon sailed through the primary without any real opposition, he still had to overcome skepticism from two separate wings of the party. On one hand, there were the conservative Republicans led by Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater, who wanted Nixon to pivot further to the right and embrace free markets. Meanwhile, the liberal Republicans, led by New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, wanted Nixon to promise more spending on social welfare. In order to unite these two wings, Nixon had to run as a centrist Republican, much as President Eisenhower had done. And, in turn, both the Goldwater wing and the Rockefeller wing of the party would campaign for their nominee in the general election. This put Nixon in a moderate position, on a similar footing, ideologically, to that of Kennedy. Thus, in terms of policy, there wasn't much daylight between these two campaigns. Both candidates in the general election promised not to raise taxes. Neither of them wanted to dismantle the welfare state. If Kennedy was at all more left-leaning, it was in the area of labor rights, where he supported an increase in the minimum wage and the repeal of the Taft-Hartley Act, which had hampered unions in the ability to strike. At the same time, however, JFK was more right-leaning in holding more hawkish views than Nixon, calling for further defense spending and attacking the Eisenhower administration for the so-called missile gap with the Soviet Union. Kennedy also said he supported arming Cuban exiles to overthrow the communist regime of Fidel Castro. Nixon criticized this suggestion in one of their televised debates, calling it dangerously irresponsible. But such attacks by Nixon were a bit hypocritical, as he too was a staunch Cold Warrior who, for example, had no problem when the Eisenhower administration overthrew the left-wing Guatemalan government during the 1954 coup. Another issue where Kennedy and Nixon shared similar positions was on civil rights, and both men could claim certain accomplishments in advancing this cause. After a telephone call with Coretta Scott King during the 1960 campaign, JFK famously called for the release of her husband who was in prison at the time. This move earned Kennedy the endorsement of Martin Luther King Sr. Nixon, for his part, had supported the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which Kennedy voted against in the Senate. When JFK attacked his Republican opponent for being part of an administration that didn't move fast enough on civil rights, Nixon was able to hit back by pointing out that JFK's running mate from Texas, Lyndon B. Johnson, had declared, during the 1956 Democratic Convention, "I am not now and never have been an advocate of civil rights. I don't think I ever will be." Jackie Robinson would also end up endorsing Nixon after Humphrey dropped out of the primaries. Robinson was critical of Kennedy, saying he was willing to ruthlessly gamble with the rights and the very lives of millions of Southern Negro Americans in order to satisfy his own personal ambition. With their tepid support for civil rights up until and during the 1960 election, it is perhaps one of the greatest ironies in American history that the civil rights movement would succeed under the administrations of Kennedy and Johnson.
And now, a word from our sponsor.
I would like to take this opportunity to express my fondness for Duff beer.
I'd also like to express my fondness for that particular beer.
A man never drank a Duff in his life.
There were two key reasons why John F. Kennedy picked Lyndon B. Johnson as his running mate. First, and more broadly, the choice of Johnson enabled Kennedy to reassure Southern Democrats that he was not too liberal on civil rights. Secondly, and more specifically, Johnson improved Kennedy's chances of carrying the swing state of Texas, which had gone for Eisenhower twice. But Johnson's contribution to the victory in Texas may very well have gone beyond the pale of legitimate politics. Ever since he was elected to the Senate in 1948, Johnson was known among his critics by a derisive nickname, Landslide Lyndon. This was not because he actually won by a landslide. On the contrary, it was a satirical reference to the fact that he had secured the Democratic nomination for the Senate primary by a mere 87 votes, in an election that nearly every historian who has studied this topic now agrees was stolen. The two most authoritative biographers of Johnson's political career are Ronnie Duggar and Robert Caro, and both conclude that Lyndon B. Johnson committed voter fraud in his 1948 Senate race. Caro documents how in one crucial precinct, Johnson's campaign stuffed the ballot boxes with 202 votes from people who had not actually voted. The perpetuators were quite sloppy, making little efforts to conceal their actions. They failed to use the same color ink used by actual voters to mark their ballots. They also used the same handwriting for all the fake votes. And, even more amazingly, they submitted the extra ballots in alphabetical order. Although Johnson's opponent, Coke Stevenson, tried to take the case to the Supreme Court, Justice Hugo Black dismissed it, ruling that federal courts are supposed to stay out of state elections. Johnson also benefited from the fact that the state of Texas had no formal recount process at the time. As a result, Lyndon B. Johnson got away with fraud in an incident that is now immortalized in U.S. political history as the Box 13 scandal, in reference to the Texas precinct where the ballot stuffing took place. Given this dubious record, it is natural to wonder if Johnson might not have resorted to similar tactics in the 1960 presidential campaign. But on the surface, such a scenario seems unlikely. John F. Kennedy carried the state of Texas by a fairly comfortable margin by more than 40,000 votes. With the Box 13 scandal, ballot boxes only needed to be stuffed with a few hundred votes, a far cry from the many tens of thousands that would have been necessary to alter a statewide voting in a presidential election. Yet, despite this apparent unlikelihood, Landslide Lyndon may very well have continued his predilection towards fraud, this time at a more massive scale, according to University of Washington historian W.J. Rohrabauer in his book, The Real Making of the President. As many as 100,000 votes had been counted that simply did not exist. This would have been more than enough to swing the results and account for JFK's comfortable margin of victory. But the fraud in Texas in 1960 went beyond ballot stuffing. Democrat precinct judges may have also been complicit, throwing out, according to Republican claims, at least 100,000 votes which would have likely gone to Nixon. To understand how this worked, we have to take a look at the odd voting system used in Texas at the time. In several counties in the state, votes were cast by means of so-called negative ballots, in which voters had to cross out all the names of the candidates they did not support instead of simply choosing the one they wanted. So, if a voter wanted to vote for Kennedy, he or she would have to cross out Nixon, as well as the two other minor candidates on the ballot. The vast majority of contested ballots were those on which a voter neglected to strike out the names of minor candidates. The GOP in Texas charged that the Democratic precinct judges were biased in choosing which ballots to throw out. As Edward Foley, a contributing Washington Post columnist who runs an election law center at Ohio University, explained in his book, Ballot Battles, there was evidence to indicate that Democrats in control of the counting process invalidated ballots if only Kennedy's name was crossed out, not counting those ballots for Nixon because two other names were also unblemished, but counted as votes for Kennedy ballots with only Nixon's name crossed out, even though these ballots also had two other unblemished names. So in places such as the heavily Republican Waller County, 25% of ballots were thrown out, but in places such as the heavily Democratic Starr County, only 1.5% of ballots were voided. In looking at the results from Texas, we must concede that there's nothing that allows us to say unequivocally that the ballot stuffing and biased ballot disqualifications were enough to alter the results. There was a lot to arouse our suspicions, but Kennedy's impressive 40,000 vote margin of victory makes it hard to conclude that Nixon would have won were it not for the fraudulent tactics of the Kennedy-Johnson campaign. We cannot, therefore, say definitively that Texas was stolen, though strong doubt remains. Illinois, on the other hand, presents a different story. There, Kennedy won by a much more narrow margin, fewer than 9,000 votes. And there is ample evidence to suggest that far more than that number were the product of fraud. At 2 a.m. on the night of the 1960 presidential election, when results of the tight race were still coming in, John F. Kennedy received a call from Chicago Mayor Richard Daley, confidently informing the Democratic candidate, with a little bit of luck and the help of a few close friends, "You're going to carry Illinois." So, how did Daley know that Kennedy would carry Illinois? Without exception, every biography written about Chicago Mayor Daley concludes that he used fraudulent practice to guarantee a Kennedy win in the state of Illinois. Mike Royko, the Chicago Daily News columnist, wrote in his memoirs that the fraud was so obvious Daley had to permit a special prosecutor to be appointed to investigate. Journalist and later diplomat John Barlow Martin, who was reporting in Chicago at the time, wrote that tales abounded of ballots dumped in the river, of votes cast by dead men or by voters registered from vacant lots. No doubt mostly true. There were many other credible accusations of fraud committed within the state of Illinois during the 1960 election. Congressional investigator Robert Blakey would conclude that enough votes were stolen, let me repeat that, stolen in Chicago to give Kennedy a sufficient margin that he carried the state of Illinois. Frank Durham, the vice chair of an election watchdog group called Committee of Honest Elections, said that the fraud in Chicago was the worst he has seen in more than 2 decades of poll watching. On election night, Mary Suthers, the only Republican member of the Chicago Board of Election Commissioners, charged that at least 10,000 voters, most of whom were Republicans, had been wrongfully removed from the voting rolls. Various precincts in Chicago also came out with results that didn't match how many voters even lived there. As acclaimed historian David Pietrasa writes in his book 1960 LBJ vs. JFK vs. Nixon, in Chicago's 6th Ward, 38th Precinct, after 43 voters had cast their ballots, the machine tally read 121 total votes. In the 2nd Ward, 50th Precinct, only 22 voters were on the official list. 77 individuals voted. In one South Side district, 22 voted. Kennedy triumphed 71-3. Unlike Texas, the more modest margin of victory in Illinois means that it is more in the realm of possibility that the Chicago machine was capable of stuffing enough votes to actually affect the results and give Kennedy a win in the state. Some might object and point to the fact that Kennedy benefited from the fact that an unpopular Republican governor named William Stratton was running for re-election that same year. Both Nixon and Eisenhower were aware of Stratton's drag on the Republican Party's presidential prospects, so it is still possible that Kennedy might have won the state anyway, and the fraud did not matter. But the rampant voter fraud in Chicago during the 1960 presidential election has become part of American political lore. Even the Kennedys have conceded to it. In 1996, when John F. Kennedy Jr., the son of the late former president, came to Chicago for a speech, he jokingly said, "In the 1940s, my grandfather bought the Chicago Merchandise Mart, and in the 1970s, my family bought the Appeal Center. And of course, in the 1960 election, my family bought 20,000 votes in Cook County." Maybe this was just another example of the strange sense of humor of the Kennedy family, or perhaps it was a mask-off moment. So, why does this all matter? Why is it even worth our time to investigate who actually won a presidential election half a century ago? In my opinion, there are two main reasons why 1960 is worth re-examining. First, it explains why the Republican Party pivoted to the right wing. I mentioned earlier that Nixon was a centrist Republican who needed to unite two separate wings of the party. But with the loss to JFK, the moderate Eisenhower-like approach became unpopular within the party and gave justification for the Republicans to try a more conservative approach to elections. Thus, in 1964, it was Barry Goldwater himself who would secure the Republican nomination. Although Goldwater lost in a landslide, Nixon would return as the nominee again in 1968. This time, his politics were more decidedly more to the right. Nixon's victory in '68 helped solidify Republican convictions that their best chances were to run from a more conservative conviction. Thus, we can speculate that if Nixon had won instead in 1960 on a centrist platform, the Republican Party might never have felt the need or desire to pivot further to the right, in which it is the Republican Party that becomes the party of civil rights and not the Democrats. But the second main reason why 1960 is worth revisiting is that it allows us to think more critically on how we should perceive the Kennedy legacy. John F. Kennedy is indisputably the most beloved former president of the post-World War II era, and it is not even close. In the most recent retrospective polling by Gallup, Kennedy has about a 90% approval rating from Democrats, Independents, and Republicans across the board. He is so popular that I was even a bit nervous about making this episode, since saying anything potentially negative about JFK is close to sacrilege in America. And JFK is certainly treated like a god in the United States. When I travel back and forth to my other home city of New York, I fly into JFK Airport. When I go to my favorite library in Grand Army Plaza in Brooklyn, there is a JFK statue outside. Everywhere I go, the Kennedy name is on streets and parks. At least 197 schools are named after JFK, and not least among them is the Kennedy School at Harvard. Even the NASA Space Center is named after Kennedy. Meanwhile, Richard Nixon has forever been labeled as the crooked villain or tricky dick, and quite frankly, that reputation is deserved. Even if he may have been the victim of Kennedy's corrupt election tactics, Nixon gets no sympathy from me. He was behind the carpet bombing of Cambodia. He was a demagogue who once said to Secretary of State Henry Kissinger that Indians really need a mass famine. And no doubt, if I had been voting in the 1960 presidential election, I would have cast my vote for Kennedy, mainly because he was better than Nixon on labor issues. But as someone who creates videos for a YouTube channel on history, I've placed responsibility on myself to tell the truth. And the unsettling truth is that John F. Kennedy's assumption to the mantle of the President of the United States was probably not a reflection of the democratic will of the people. It may very well have been the result of underhanded and illegal activity. In the razor-close election, the difference between victory and defeat might have been determined by fraud. Let's also take a quick look at what John F. Kennedy actually did as president. Kennedy, of course, fulfilled the promise of arming exiled Cubans, but the result was a disastrous attempt to overthrow Castro in the notorious Bay of Pigs incident. Kennedy also followed through on his promise not to raise taxes, and he went further by actually cutting taxes on the wealthy. It was, in fact, Kennedy who popularized the expression, "a rising tide lifts all boats," a phrase and logic that would later be used to support Ronald Reagan's false promise of trickle-down economics. Before his death, Kennedy laid the foundation for the CIA to orchestrate a coup in Brazil that overthrew its democracy in 1964. While he's often praised for his tough decision-making during the Cuban Missile Crisis, popular history often neglects to point out that the Soviet decision to send nuclear weapons in Cuba was a reaction to an early deployment of US weapons in Turkey. Furthermore, it was Kennedy who approved dropping chemical weapons in Vietnam with Agent Orange, which continues to plague the country where birth defects are still increasing more than half a century after the war. To this day, many children are born deaf, some are paralyzed. It is therefore imperative that we start to re-examine what actually happened in the 1960 presidential election in order to break the myth of Camelot. The race was not merely one between the chivalrous Kennedy against the monstrous Nixon, but like almost any other US presidential election, it was a campaign between two opportunistic politicians gunning for the throne of the empire. Because Kennedy's life ended in an assassination, he has become something of a martyr within the American psyche, and this has placed him beyond any criticism or even scrutiny. But for those of us who are committed to the truth, John F. Kennedy must be viewed as a complicated political figure. He was not a saint nor a romantic hero like the Knights of Camelot. He was a power-hungry politician who may very well have stooped to stealing an election.